Okay.
All right, good morning. Let's join together in a time of meditation before we go into the teachings and the parables. I invite you to take a few moments to relax, feel your breathing, feel your oneness, your connection to your environment, how you are held up by the earth and breathing the atmosphere, and in your consciousness there are the sun, the moon, and the heavens, and all people. Enter into this awareness of oneness. Relax and enter into it. For the teaching is that God is omnipresence. God is spirit. God is love, wisdom. God is good. And so this spirit, this mind that is all love, all wisdom, all knowing, is present and expressing in, through, and as every point in the universe, every point in your body, every space and state of your soul. This omnipresence is expressing not only in you and not only through you, but as you. I invite you to know this oneness. Know that the life that flows through you and your breath and your heartbeat, your muscles and nerves, sinews and bones, the life that flows through you is God life. Even the form of your body is a perfect idea in divine mind. So I invite you to feel that life, that energy. Feel the perfection of what you are physically. We may not always be aware of this perfection. We may not always feel it, but now in this time of turning inward, we open ourselves to knowing and feeling the perfection of what we are, to feeling the harmony, the order, the life, the light that we are. As we focus on the truth of the divine presence, we release and let go of all lesser thoughts, lesser ideas, all erroneous opinions and beliefs, and fully and freely accept that we are divine beings through and through. We are God being, God becoming, God expressing right now in the eternal now. In this consciousness of oneness, we realize that we are one with all those we encounter, all those we think of. So I invite you now to think of just the folks in this group, your fellow travelers, your spiritual family. Think of each other and realize and feel your oneness, your connection with each one. What is the feeling of oneness in simplest possible terms? It is feeling love. So now we let divine love fully feel our consciousness, not only our consciousness of our bodies, not only our consciousness of our surroundings, but our consciousness of each other, our consciousness of everyone and everything in our lives. We realize this oneness, we realize this divine love. And we recognize the divine unity, harmony, order of the universe established through divine law. Divine law, perfect ideas of divine mind establish reunification, reharmonization, reordering of the universe, establishing balance and harmony in all things. And so we are not impatient. We are open and patient and knowing that divine law reestablishes harmony and order in all things. We trust that process to happen in our bodies, in our lives, and in our world. So let us now, in confidence, in gratitude, rest for a few moments of knowing the divine presence is love, life, law, harmony, order, all good, right now. Be still and know. The divine presence transcends anything that we may think or say. So our experience of the divine in the silence is beyond our ability to put into words, but still it is a knowing. And so we move forward in this consciousness into our world, in this knowing, in this gratitude, and joyfully we express all that we are as children of God. We give thanks and we take on the Christ consciousness. And so it is. Amen. All right. Breathe into the moment. Thank you for inviting me to share some thoughts on parables of Jesus. Parables are one of the ways that Jesus taught. He had other ways, including simply his presence, his consciousness. We'll focus, though, on the parables. Excuse me. Excuse me. The parables, of course, fundamentally are stories. They have characters, they have plot. And when we read or hear a story, we tend to empathetically identify with one or more of the characters. And of course, the more we can empathize with all the characters, the more we can get fully the meaning of what the stories are about. But stories evoke empathy. And like any good story, parables do not explicitly state meanings and morals. Instead, they challenge us to derive meaning and morals from our own consciousness. Whenever we read a book or watch a movie or a stage program, we draw our own conclusions from the story, each one of us. It draws something from within us, not only empathy, but a higher understanding of our nature as human beings and sometimes even the nature of the divine. Jesus's parables were entertaining and surprising stories, sometimes with a satirical or humorous edge. They were intended to evoke empathy and open the minds of his listeners to new perspectives. He used parables to challenge his listeners to open their hearts and minds, to see things in a new way, to draw from deeper levels of their consciousness. As Jesus traveled around Galilee and the surrounding territories, over 90% of the people he encountered were farm laborers, fishermen, and what we might call construction workers, who all worked for subsistence wages. They, as we say today, lived on the edge of poverty. There were also, of course, occasional priests, rabbis, Roman soldiers, and tax collectors who were a little better off than the farmers and the laborers that he mostly encountered. And then, as now, the truly wealthy were a very tiny percentage of the total population. So Jesus's listeners were mostly impoverished. They knew about greedy landlords, tax collectors, business managers, and slavery. Modern Christians tend to assume, I think, that any rich man in a parable represents God. But Jesus' audience was familiar with the Jewish prophetic tradition, in which God is on the side of the poor and the oppressed, not necessarily the rich. His listeners would not have assumed that a rich man was supposed to represent God, as we sometimes assume. If anything, they might assume when a rich man shows up in a story that he's going to be the villain of the piece. Today, I want to look at what is probably the most confusing of all Jesus's parables. We might as well start with the most confusing one. This story is commonly known as the parable of the unjust steward, and it's found in the Gospel of Luke. Now, a steward was a business manager, and the translation I'm using has the term manager in place of steward that you might find in some of other conventional translations. The translation I'm using is it's called the Scholars Version. It was developed by the scholars of the Jesus Seminar. Well, these scholars considered this parable as authentically originating from Jesus. That's what they were looking for. What can we say with great confidence originated with Jesus? Well, here's how the story goes. There was this rich man whose manager had been accused of squandering his master's property. He called him in and said, "What's this I hear about you? Let's have an audit of your management because your job is being terminated." Then the manager said to himself, "What am I going to do? My master is firing me. I'm not strong enough to dig ditches, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've got it. I know what I'll do so doors will open for me when I'm removed from management." So he called in each of his master's debtors. He said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He said, 500 gallons of olive oil. And he said to him, "Here's your invoice. Sit down and right now make it 250. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" He said, 1,000 bushels of wheat. He says to him, "Here's your invoice. Make it 800. The master praised the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. That's how the original story ended. Before I go into interpretation of the parable, I invite you to notice how you feel about the parable. At what point do you think that Jesus was making? Now, Luke, who records this story, was a highly educated man. He was not really part of the original impoverished audience that Jesus mostly spoke to. Luke felt it was necessary to provide an interpretation for his readers. The scholars of the Jesus Seminar, most scholars, do not believe that these interpretations provided in Luke actually came from Jesus. It was a common practice for educated compilers of sayings to provide interpretations for the readers. For example, you've probably read Aesop's fables, and usually you've read them probably with an accompanying moral to the story. It's a historical fact that the morals were added by the people who compiled Aesop's fables. We know this because different collections have different morals for the same stories. So this was a common practice in the way people wrote in those days. Luke then provides an interpretation of the story, which it is suggested that Jesus is actually giving, but it's really Luke's interpretation. So he starts by saying that this is what the story means. Use your ill-gotten gain to make friends for yourselves so that when the bottom falls out, they are there to welcome you into eternal dwelling places. So Luke interpreted this parable as saying that the way to get to heaven is to use ill-gotten gains to make friends. So they'll welcome you into heaven. But do other people really decide whether or not you get into heaven? What if the friends you make are even more immoral and dishonest than you are? Is it then left to them to determine your everlasting fate? This interpretation is clearly not entirely satisfactory. After all, even back then, people thought it was not human financial clients but God who determines your eternal dwelling place. So Luke must not have felt completely satisfied with the first interpretation, so he goes on and continues with another idea. One who cheats in trivial matters will also cheat where large amounts are concerned. If you can't be trusted with something that belongs to another, who will let you have property of your own? Well, this statement may be true and good business and moral, but it doesn't really fit the case of the story. It doesn't really fit the case of the dishonest manager. At the end of the story, even the master, the rich employer, praises the man for his shrewdness. Luke completes his interpretation actually with an authentic saying of Jesus. So now we're actually back to something Jesus said. No servant can be slave to two masters. You can't be enslaved to both God and a bank account. Okay, that's more familiarly known as you cannot serve God and mammon, but this is a more accurate, I guess you could say, or meaningful translation. You can't be enslaved to both God and a bank account. Well, it's a beautiful saying and a truth, but the saying does not quite fit the outcome of the parable. In the parable, the manager was praised for finding a way out of his dilemma. That's what the story is about. How does he get out of the mess he's gotten himself into? The audience would have empathized with and even rooted for the man about to be cast into the poverty that they lived with, the role of digging ditches or begging. There are many beggars in those times. So they would have empathized with him rather than with the concerns of the rich man. Furthermore, the listeners would have assumed that the clients who had their debts reduced would help the fired manager. That's what he was counting on, and the listeners would have assumed that that was a good expectation. Why? Because in those times, the exchange of favors was the core of business relationships. People considered it shameful not to return a favor. We do that today somewhat. That's probably still part of our social consciousness. But then it was an idea that basically shaped the culture. If someone does you a favor, it's expected that you will repay it, because if you don't, you're not a person who can be trusted. And in some cases, people would be ostracized when it was found out that they had not returned favors. So by forgiving some of his clients' debts, the manager does the debtors a favor. And so in the context of that culture and that society, he can fully expect employment in return. That's kind of the point of the story. In other words, the parable illustrates the very practical value of debt forgiveness, or we might say of giving discounts, making friends with your clients by giving them special deals, by forgiving, in this case, specifically, literally forgiving debts. The manager's surprising cleverness might even have provoked laughter. It's the story arc, a common comic story arc in which the underdog somehow manages to prevail. We see that story arc in almost any comedy that we might see in stage or movies or books. Now, Jesus told another story about the practical value of forgiveness. This one's recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. This parable is a little darker. It has a form of a cautionary tale, really, rather than the comedy arc that we see in the other story. Now, the translation I'm sharing again does some things to make this more accessible while accurately expressing what's found in the original Greek. And so one of the things it does is it replaces ancient money currency names like talents and denarii. It replaces them with what would be approximately the amount today, relatively the amount today in dollars. So that's one difference in the story. And the story is about about a ruler and his slaves. Now, in those days, enslaved people came from conquered lands, and some educated enslaved people held positions as business managers and tutors to the children of the well-off. So some well-educated servants had extensive responsibilities and actually better incomes than the common laborers and farm workers. In fact, in those days, many slaves could actually eventually save enough money to buy their freedom. In the parable, a ruler decides to settle accounts with his slaves. So he's bringing in all his business managers, those who manage his business, to see how they've been doing with his money and with his property. And then so the story continues this way. When the process begins, this debtor is brought to him who owed $10 million. Since he couldn't pay it back, the ruler ordered him sold along with his wife and children and everything he had so he could recover his money. At this prospect, the slave fell down and groveled before him. "Be patient with me, and I will repay every cent." Because he was compassionate, the master of that slave let him go and canceled the debt. As soon as he got out, the same fellow collared one of his fellow slaves who owed him $100 and grabbed him by the neck and demanded, "Pay back what you owe." His fellow servant fell down and begged him, "Be patient with me and I'll pay you back." But he wasn't interested. Instead, he went out and threw him in prison until he paid the debt. When his fellow slaves realized what had happened, they were terribly distressed and went and reported to their master everything that had taken place. At that point, the master summoned him. "You wicked slave," he says to him, "I canceled your entire debt because you begged me. Wasn't it only fair for you to treat your fellow slave with the same consideration as I treated you?" The master was so angry, he handed him over to those in charge of punishment until he paid back everything he owed. Well, that's how the story ends. Now you can see this parable suggests negative consequences for not forgiving. The slave refused to forgive, so he was not forgiven. If only this first man had forgiven the $100 debt that was owed to him, he would have had $1 million debt canceled. Clearly, he made an unfortunate choice. Now, the justice at the end of the story would have been as satisfying to the audience as the triumph of the so-called unjust steward in the first story. Now, it may be difficult to believe that a master would forgive $10 million. But it's easy to believe that in the given circumstances, the master would have been upset enough to revoke his original merciful choice and instead impose justice. The massive debt forgiven at first heightens the injustice of the slave's behavior to his fellow slave. Forgiven $10 million, he refuses to forgive a $100 debt, or even to allow time for it to be repaid. The parables point to this world practical consequences of forgiveness and unforgiveness. And of course, these stories do have deeper psychological and metaphysical meanings. We can call them, for one thing, illustrations of law. Holding to unforgiveness puts us in a prison of resentment and anger. Forgiving others sets us free and connects us to others and reconnects us to others psychologically. And this, of course, applies to forgiving ourselves for past mistakes or present flaws. The peace and love that comes from unforgiving can even help to prosper and heal us. Psychologically, forgiveness is beneficial. Forgiveness is a choice, but it's not always an easy one. Like the master and the slaves in the second parable, we want justice. And those two desires often conflict in our consciousness. The desire on the one hand to be compassionate, to forgive. The desire on the other hand to have justice. So how can we reconcile those internal conflicting ideas and desires. I think that one thing that's important to remember is the psychological, the soul benefit, if you will, of practicing forgiveness. It's always beneficial psychologically to forgive, because when we forgive, we are releasing burdens of anger and resentment that we're carrying around. It's a wonderful old, I call it saying or metaphor, a term, I guess. People talk about bearing a grudge. And I always thought that was a very colorful sort of idea, because the idea of bearing is the idea of carrying something. And what exactly would a grudge look like? I sort of imagine a heavy, sort of ugly thing that we're trying to carry around that burdens us. Anger and resentment are psychological burdens. So letting those go through learning how to forgive is a thing that releases us, that sets us free, that takes a weight off. Now, it's difficult, but possible to internally forgive crimes against ourselves and our loved ones and still do externally what we can for the cause of justice. It's a little bit of a balancing act, isn't it? To learn to internally let go, but at the same time, externally seek justice. And we know that this is a thing that in the everyday world is just a necessity. Society with no laws and a society with no consequences for things like assault on persons and property is no society at all. It's anarchy, it's chaos. So as long as people behave recklessly, selfishly, and violently, establishing impartial justice is necessary to protect the innocent, to keep order and harmony in a society. Mercy should be part of a justice system, but so should consequences for actions. We recognize this simply as a practical thing. I had a friend who observed that, generally speaking, mercy is what we want for ourselves and justice is what we want for other people. But I think we really want both for everyone. And again, it's a balancing act. As we develop understanding and wisdom, we can perceive when mercy for others is better in the context of a justice system. At the same time, we can learn to forgive even the seemingly worst offenses of humanity against us or against others. We can learn to do that internally, even while, and psychologically, even while insisting upon this balancing act that's involved in living in a just society. So the first step in practicing forgiveness, this internal forgiveness, the first step is to simply recognize its practical benefits. Nothing so motivates us as practical benefits of certain kinds of behavior. So this recognition provides a motivation, recognition of the truth of that. And that's really what Jesus was conveying with these stories. He was first conveying that forgiveness can have a very practical value. It can get you out of a jam, as it did in the story of the unjust servant. It can prevent you from getting into a jam, as we saw in the cautionary tale of the slave who was forgiven $10 million. That's what those stories illustrate, these practical benefits in the outer. And of course, we know as students of spiritual truth that there's that internal benefit as well. That's even more important because we face the world every day with our consciousness. And if we are bearing grudges, if we're carrying around resentment and anger in our consciousness as we go through our daily lives, that burden's on us. It's not on anyone else. And so we want to release from that. That's the practical value, and that's a thing that it's important to recognize. There's a reason, a practical reason for doing the work of forgiveness. Jesus taught this as a law. I like to call it the cosmic loophole in the law of karma. He taught forgive and you will be forgiven. He taught it as a law, cause and effect, consequences, right? And so we may tend to think of this in terms of our relationship with God, and that's a significant piece of it. But we can also think of it simply psychologically, right? We can think of it psychologically that as we forgive, we're really the ones who are released. We're the ones who are forgiven. So that first step is to recognize what we're dealing with here is something that's practical and something that is a spiritual law. Forgive and you'll be forgiven. The second step, after recognizing the practical value, the second step is to simply hold the intention to forgive. Now, again, that's a choice that we can make. Even when we hold the intention, we may still have to struggle with getting there, but at least we know where we want to get to. We know that whatever else that may be going on, there's some value in us learning to forgive, and we set that intention to do so. And of course, the third step is simply practically doing that. And the primary way that we know of to practice forgiveness is to hold forgiving thoughts. We might hold these in prayer and meditation. We might think of them through the day. We might remind ourselves to forgive. I found that focusing first on the idea of divine love empowers us to be able to release things. And so we can hold thoughts such as divine love through me dissolves and releases all unforgiving thoughts and feelings. Divine love through me dissolves and releases all unforgiving thoughts and feelings. When we get in touch with infinite love, even just a little bit, it empowers us to forgive, to release. Or perhaps I should say, it allows the power of divine love through us to forgive and release. We can also say, as we realize this truth, I loose you and let you go. I choose not to carry the burden of unforgiveness. I loose you and let you go. I choose not to carry the burden of unforgiveness. You're making a choice here to set yourself free in your thought, to not allow the behaviors of others to burden your consciousness, to determine how you act and how you feel. I loose you and let you go. I choose not to carry the burden of unforgiveness. And so I'd like to invite you right now to think of one or choose someone to forgive. Maybe even what you choose is your own past self, things that maybe you've done in the past that you need to release, that you've been judging yourself for, that you've been unforgiving towards your past self, right? To think of that, to choose someone, even if it's your past self, to apply these thoughts to do that right now. So I want you to think of someone, choose someone, and then hold this thought. So I'll repeat the thought and invite you to repeat it silently, directing at whoever it is that you're choosing to forgive. Divine love through me dissolves and releases all unforgiving thoughts and feelings. Divine love through me dissolves and releases all unforgiving thoughts and feelings. Repeat that a couple of times silently to feel that truth. Divine love through me dissolves and releases all unforgiving thoughts and feelings. I loose you and let you go. I loose you and let you go. Finally, I choose not to carry the burden of unforgiveness. Make this resolution to yourself for your own benefit. I choose not to carry the burden of unforgiveness. Jesus once said, when a disciple asked him, how many times should I forgive? Even up to 7 times, Jesus said 7 times 70. So if you can count to 490 and you've forgiven a person 490 times, you've held these thoughts 490 times, and it still hasn't worked, then you have disproved this statement of Jesus. But I suspect you'll be able to release it well before you hit 490. But if you really want to test that out, I don't think he was being literal there, but if you really want to test that out, I suppose you could keep a chart. But this is something that I found, and sometimes something will come back, an incident will come back from your memory. You thought you've let it go, it comes back, and you have those same feelings. You can use these kinds of affirmations. I think simply saying, once you get into the sense of that, simply saying, I loose you and let you go, can be very powerful. It reminds you a little bit of something that Jesus said once in the context of a healing story. Loose him and let him go, right? So we can choose to release the stuff that we carry around, the burdens of grudges, of anger, resentment, and unforgiveness. As you release that, as we release these things, we are released and we are healed. So in simplest possible terms, these two parables that we've discussed today simply illustrate the law of cause and effect. As Jesus put it, forgive, and you will be forgiven. Thank you.
Thank you.